Hey, this is Trav here, and just a quick reminder that this podcast relies on the kindness of my Patreons, and I would like to thank the following people: Bill, Brendan, Grant, Lisa, Mog, Dan, and Paula. Your constant monthly donation really helps out, and if you can spare $1, the link to my Patreon is in the description. Anyway, thanks for listening. Here's the show. Hey, welcome to episode 162 of Tales from the Mine Boat, the slow-moving seaside carnival ride inside the foggy, dreary, rainy, mystical mornings of my mind. This is Trav Nash speaking, and thank you very much for listening to this episode. It really does mean a lot. And today's show is all about my time working in this horrible margarine factory and how depressing that was, and how we had to deal with a machine that was constantly breaking down, and how lately I've been feeling pretty much like that broken down machine. So it's a good show, and all you need to do is sit back, relax, think about what you're going to do during this holiday season as we set sail. I used to work in this factory that manufactured margarine. It was probably one of the worst periods of my life. Part of my job was to maintain a consistent stack of cups and lids that would be fed into the rotating metal carousel that poured hot clumps of orange, disgusting looking margarine into the cups that would be sent down the line to be boxed, stacked, and sent to the freezer to be frozen and delivered to a local supermarket near you, where you could pick them up as some multi-grain loaf of bread to be eaten without the how and why of the long process it took for all these elements to eventually come together and finally meet their end as they swell in your mouth as you chew, tear, rip and swallow. This machine was in this tiny separate room to the factory floor. It was boxed in to keep it clean and sterile as much as any area of a factory floor could be. This had to be somewhere cleaner than other areas, as a rabbi would come in to make sure everything is kosher for the kosher version of the margarine, which normally meant he would arrive early in the morning before production and would enter into the little room and then come out again and give his okay, and then ride away out of the loading bay on what looked like a child's scooter. Aside from this once a month occurrence, it was pretty much the same routine day in and day out. The machine's pneumatic system of compressed air hoses would wheeze and spittle as metal arms would rise and fall, suck the lids into its metal arms and then clip them into place, reuniting the lids with the margarine cups as they sailed off through a little hole in the wall onto a conveyor belt in a long line of other cups waiting to be sorted and boxed at the end of the line. The job was to stand there with two big boxes behind you. One was full of lids and the other was full of empty cups. You had to keep making sure the stacks of lids and cups that were feeding into the machine were always full. You were constantly feeding this machine more lids and more cups until the order was met. The machine was built by engineers to complete this one task: fill up the cups and put the lids on and then send them out of the room. But there was never one day of working in that factory that I showed up for within those 7 years that the machine didn't break down or break its rhythm and start putting lids down before the cups could even swivel into position. And when this would happen, the machine would dump its yellow gloop payload regardless if there was a cup there to catch it. A mound of custard yellow would now be growing in size with each time the machine swiveled around and no cups to be filled. And if you weren't quick enough to notice straight away, it could very easily become a huge mess. And all you could do was hit that emergency stop button that would stop the whole production line. And only when everything had officially stopped would it now be safe to open the clear plastic safety guard around the machine and use a bag of old rags to try and quickly clean and soak up the mess as quickly as possible. You'll need to try and do this and get things going yourself. Otherwise, in the lunchroom, reading the paper and sipping on tiny cups of espresso, expressively pinched between two fingers, the maintenance man would have to put his paper down and his espresso, and would have to come crawling into the crawl space under the machine to see what was happening. And he always put this down to human error. He was this grumpy old guy who seemed to be annoyed any time he was required to do his job that he was hired for. He was the kind of person who had been there for years and had burrowed himself deep into the workplace enough to look like he knew what he was doing. And he knew that his job was secure enough for him to be able to do as little as possible and be confident that his job would always be there. His mission statement was always to do the bare minimum. He would stomp across the factory floor like someone seeking revenge for the brutal murder of one of his children, and would climb into the small little room with you, and no matter what the problem might be, it was always because you did it somehow, and you were an idiot. What have you done would be the first question, and nothing would always be the answer. All other workers who had been working there for decades watched on and shook their heads, and grouped together like creepy locals from The Wicker Man. He would then look up at the ceiling and let out some kind of sound of heavily exhaled annoyance, and then storm out of the room again and head into the maintenance room for his tools. His frustration was always leaning on the brink of full-blown rage, and you would naturally feel like you had to get out of there before he punched you in the gut, as this little man would climb into the sealed-off box area to tighten loose bolts or wind back cranks to lock the machine into place again. Eventually he would fix it enough to have it start up again, and he would give me a look of "don't break this machine," and then would head back to the lunchroom to put his feet up again and finish the paper he was reading. But it was always inevitable that the machine would break down again, no matter what you did or how many times it was sort of kind of fixed. I always felt the blame was unwarranted, as it's not normal to stand in a room filling the machine with cups and lids. There was this toxic gas box of chlorine and the smell of burnt toast. Every day I kind of dreaded that the smell I was actually smelling might be because I'm having a heart attack. The whole factory was a perpetual greenhouse, and whatever the temperature was outside, it almost doubled that in the factory. And if you worked there for 8 hours or more, you'd sweat off 10 kilograms. There was nothing the maintenance guy ever did that made the machine ever run smoothly for more than 3 hours at best. In fact, there was one time that the machine was so broken for almost 6 months that the machine was not putting enough weight on the lids when it clipped them into place, and a huge amount of margarine containers had the corner of the lids sticking up. The solution that the brains trust in their air-conditioned offices came up with was to have someone stand just outside the room and push down all the lids manually as they whooshed past you. This was an impossible task. Again, you would be blamed for not keeping up, or that odd lid that eluded you was caught further down the line with its lid up, or worst case scenario, it would tip over in the packing machine and cover all the machine parts in hot margarine. You were basically doing what the machine could not, and no matter how many times this happened, it was never the machine's fault. The maintenance guy always seemed so annoyed when the machine broke down, and always needed someone to blame for making him do his job. Without this machine needed to be maintained, it kind of negated his job. You would think the fact that the machine consistently was in a state of breaking down and being so unreliable would keep him happy that his job was secure, but I guess he was confident enough in the fact that he could get away with minimal effort and somehow this was acceptable, and never put his job into question. It was almost as if he knew that doing basically nothing would inevitably lead his job to be internally secure. This machine had one job. It was designed to do this one job. It was a complex looking metal carousel of corroded metal and plastic wires and tubes. It looked like something you would find in Wonka's chocolate factory. The complexity of the machine would make you think it should be more reliable than it actually was. But it was only a matter of time before the whole line would come to a halt, and this meant everyone had to stay even longer now until the orders for the day were met. Sometimes the machine could be down for hours, and you were expected to look busy, not stand around as the bosses would come out all anxious and uptight, looking for someone they can blame for wasting their time and money. The fault always had to be human, which if you think about it is a fair call. We are bound to break things or not be as efficient as a machine that only really has one specific task. We are not machines. This isn't what we're born and raised to do, at least I hope we're not. I don't believe that our lives should only consist of standing by some conveyor belt pushing the lids down on margarine containers that a machine could not. This was a bleak, dark time in my life. I don't think I've ever been more depressed before. The minutes felt like hours and the seconds dragged their feet through mounds of hot margarine. I fantasized about climbing out the emergency exit and jumping one story where we were and running off into the horizon and never coming back again. Would sometimes look up at the skylight above me and see beyond the cobwebbed girders that held the roof up, and would promise myself when I get out of here today I'd appreciate those sunny days and blue skies a lot more than I already have been taken for granted, but still I never did. The only way to get through the day was to program yourself to work on autopilot and drift away in your imagination to somewhere and someplace better than where you currently were. Eventually I would have to look back down to see the cluster of cups that must have got caught on the railing and were now piling up, and you would have to quickly act to free those cups that were now spilling out over the floor. If this happened, the line would have to be stopped again, where you had to find more rags to soak up even more of the horrible goop of dark yellow fat. The amount of rags we went through in a day, if you sewed them all together, would probably blanket the entire neighborhood, keeping everyone warm and toasty at night. During this time is when I had one of my first seizures, and I was quickly put on some generic epilepsy medication, which had terrible side effects that would slow down my reaction time, and I constantly felt like I was in a sea fog that made it almost impossible to concentrate, especially on a job that was so repetitive. Because of this, everyone in this factory assumed that I had severe learning difficulties and would talk down to me in this slow, condescending tone, like you would talk to a child that needs to be told something very specific and you doubted they had the intelligence to really understand. How I kept this job was a mystery. I guess just as mysterious as most of the staff who were there, who did very little and just relied on people like myself, who were brought in for a temp agency. And even though I worked there exclusively for this company for years full-time, I was never taken on full-time and never knew what it was like to have job security. Every day it felt like my last, and I had mixed emotions of wanting to leave but at the same time needing to pay bills. I had the look of someone who was permanently stoned, and it made me a bigger target to be blamed for everything and anything that could go wrong, even if I was nowhere near the scene of the crime. And to be fair, sometimes it was, because I honestly struggled to maintain long-term concentration. But I was trying my hardest. I was trying to muster an enormous amount of concentration and swipe the fog away like flies around my eyes, and just try and push through the day without being fired so I could come back the next day and actually earn a wage. Every day I struggled, I became more and more miserable. I wasn't being paid enough to be this miserable and stressed. I was mentally exhausted from trying to maintain focus and concentration to be a servant for a machine that was always serving curveballs at me, like it somehow knew it could get away with it and never be blamed. It was like being in a terrible abusive relationship. All of us, I think, are more than our day jobs. We have our own lives and relationships with others, family dramas and rent that is always due, utilities that seem to be trying to drain more and more of your savings every month, like some kind of vampire that saves by sucking away all your income. It is maddening to think how much time we waste doing the job that we hate just to keep living. We have to deal with all these things and whatever else life throws at us, and still show up for work and keep doing the same task over and over again, with 100% efficiency is expected. An expectation that anybody with empathy would consider unrealistic, even for those machines that we build to do those one tasks that they are designed for. And like those machines, we can easily break down from too much pressure or expectation or overuse, and we will continue to break down until eventually we are discarded for more modern streamlined versions or upgrades, as you can easily become obsolete and the new will be there to improve on what was considered unimprovable. I worked at that factory for far too long, and it now has been many years since those dark days. I still have nightmares of margarine building up and needing to be cleaned of rags that are caked in yellow goop, and those kneading machines that keep breaking on purpose to see if I'll eventually crack or go mad in its malicious plan to watch me finally lose my mind as I deteriorate into madness. Thankfully these days are pretty stress-free as I try and find out what's going on with my health. I feel like I fluctuate somewhere in between this slight feeling of optimism to being the kind of crazy person who wears a sandwich board that reads the end is 9. I wish I had my own maintenance team, even if they were slightly shirty and irritated at the thought of having to fix me every time I broke down or malfunctioned. It's tough to sit in waiting rooms for over an hour just to be told by a specialist the obvious, that I have a lot of different things that seem to be going on, and in general the human brain is a complicated thing that even the most brilliant minds are still walking the earth don't really have a grasp of. I was told a few weeks ago to basically learn how to meditate and try not to worry when I feel my brain is hurting or doing something weird, or the pacemaker in my heart that is trying to use my heart like a punching bag to get it working normally again. I was basically told to learn to live with it and get on with my life. And I don't know why, but it made me feel like I hit a wall at full speed. Maybe it's really the reality I have to come to terms with. But I found it odd that only a month earlier, this man was so optimistic to help and told us he was going to do some research and find a treatment plan to help me get my life back to some kind of normal again. The second time we saw him, it was like talking to a completely different person. It was no longer talk of a plan of action or even a follow-up. It was basically a shrugged shoulder and a good luck and maybe don't think too much about it and smile more. I can't help but feel like that machine had broken down again and I was being blamed for holding everyone's life up. The disapproving face of that maintenance man was now eerily taking the shape over the specialist's face, and I felt a white cold chill wash over me, and I was suddenly drained of any momentum and drive that had been building up over the start of this year. Suddenly I was back to zero again with my original mantra, what is the point? Since our last consultation, I felt certain for the first time since these seizures started that we had finally found someone who was going to put everything back on track. There was going to be no more waiting rooms and shrugged shoulders, just people who can say exactly what is going on and assure me that it's treatable or could be maintained in a way that I could get back to feeling slightly better than I currently am and keep producing and keep making things, keep living and being human. On the way back out of the hospital, following that green painted exit line that wound around tight compact corridors away from the consultation room, I felt that same helpless feeling I felt in the factory, stuck inside a box feeding this needy machine and getting nowhere. I was at a point in my life that felt like I was stuck on replay and didn't want to be here anymore. In some ways I was still pushing lids down and dreaming of clear blue skies, and now I was in this vast void of uncertainty. There was no longer an option, and there was no longer an option or a window of possible escape towards that sky. All I can do now is sink until I flood the whole entire system, until it shuts down all operations, once and for all. I've been so unmotivated lately, and I've been trying to fix this, as a huge portion of my time has been burned away doing nothing productive. Each day that I waste away, it becomes harder to get back on track, and it seems further and further away. I've tried all the tricks in the books that have worked in the past to try and break this curse, like rewarding myself with a video game or a coffee, if I get even a small portion of a task that I need to get done for someone completed. But I just can't seem to begin or feel the drive to make anything. The passion to make something new is barely there. It's just a tiny spark that is barely keeping the lights on, and I have no real explanation for this. Things in general, I guess, are a lot better than other times. I don't really have any stress or responsibility like the majority of people do. And perhaps this is why I feel so empty and keep questioning myself, why can't I get things done? And then answering myself with, what's the point? Or what does any of this really matter? I think of the broken machine that nobody wanted to admit was broken and needed to be fully restored. The quick temporary fixes that were constantly being used to only solve the problem for a small period of time. They would become shorter and shorter every time they were applied. I'm not sure what I can do other than try and push through, regain the focus to keep going and keep a steady stream of output from my own production line. It's one of those few things I can keep consistent and recharge my fleeting confidence in myself and my place in the whole scheme of everything. We recently went back to that same consultation room and saw a different specialist this time, and we had to once again start listing off the last 10 years of my worsening health, once again to a new set of ears, and thankfully this woman listened and said the only thing that she can do is book me in for another week of observation at the hospital, hook my head up to the machines again and see if they can't catch the consistent problem that is hiding somewhere in my brain. She assured me if they didn't find anything this time, they will keep trying until they find the problem, as these things are very hard to pinpoint. This made me feel instantly a lot better. Finally, it seems something is at least going to be done in the near future. But at the same time, I dreaded returning to hospital and being restricted to a bed and a small room with wires coming out of my head, chest and legs. But if it could get us any closer to some kind of definitive answer, I will endure it once again. Until then, I still feel broken. And for the past 10 years or so, years of ignoring the problem never made it go away. Things just got worse, and more faith in myself and optimism that things will one day get better ended up on the dirty cold concrete floor of the factory. Maybe sometimes you need to shut the whole system down for a week to get someone who knows what they're doing to really get into the inner machinery of how it all works to see where the fault lies. I believe that everything has some kind of cause and effect, and if it's not maintained, it will eventually stop working as it was designed. Ignoring the obvious fact that there is a recurring problem that needs your attention is the worst thing you can do, and no quick fix can ever truly resolve the real complicated problems in our lives. Identifying that something is a problem is the best thing we can do, and then finding the courage to ask for help, because it is quite unlikely that you could fix the problem on your own. Only when you establish this fact that you can make a more permanent upgrade, or at the very least stop blaming human error for a machine that was broken to begin with. We'll see how the rest of the year plays out, and I hope to regain my regular output again, because this is no way to waste the days away. That's it for another week. Thank you very much for listening to this episode. I really do appreciate it. And if you like this episode, then why not rate, like, and subscribe on the very device you're using. That would really help me out. Leaving a review is also extremely awesome if you like this episode. Just telling someone to their face, recommending it to someone you know who listens to podcasts. Maybe this is something they might be into, and doing so, I'd be eternally thankful. You can follow this podcast on Facebook and Twitter just by searching for Tales from the Line Boat Podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at Nashtopia, or you can follow my Instagram at Trav Nash Draw Stuff, where you can see a drawing that I try to do every day to try and maintain my productivity. The music for this podcast is composed by Tim Witt, and you can listen to his music right now on SoundCloud just by searching for Tim Witt Sounds, or you can acquire his 2 albums at Bandcamp right now, which are extraordinarily good. If you can spare it as minimal as $1 to my Patreon, that would be really appreciated, and it would help me pay to keep things going for at least another month. You can opt out any times, and it's completely optional, but your support keeps this podcast going. So thanks again for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. New episodes every Monday. I hope you're doing well. You have a good week, and as always, peace.